The sun was slowly dipping behind the trees, painting the quiet suburban streets in shades of gold and orange. She'd been driving home after a long day, her mind still wrapped around the meetings and errands that had filled every hour. The roads were familiar, and yet in that calm evening light something felt slightly off. She adjusted her grip on the steering wheel, taking a deep breath, and reminded herself to relax. After all, it had been a long week, and all she wanted now was to get home, unwind, and leave the day behind. As she rounded a corner, she noticed a patrol car parked just past the stop sign. Its lights flicked on, a soft but clear signal for her to pull over. Her stomach sank slightly, but she kept her composure. She had always believed in following the rules, in staying calm no matter the circumstances. Slowly, she eased her car to the side of the road, turning on the hazard lights as she stopped. The cop stepped out of the car, his boots crunching lightly on the gravel. There was a sense of authority in his stance, but also something else, something that didn't feel entirely professional. He approached her window, shining a flashlight briefly before lowering it. "Good evening," he said, his tone clipped. "Do you know why I stopped you?" She shook her head politely, her hands resting on the wheel. "No, officer, I don't." He leaned slightly closer, squinting at her face as if trying to read something that wasn't there. "You were going a little over the speed limit back there. License and registration, please." She handed him the documents without hesitation. "Here you go." "I'm sorry if I was speeding, I didn't realize." The cop examined the papers slowly, his eyes flicking back and forth. There was a pause, and then he spoke again. "Do you live around here?" His tone had a faint edge, a hint of suspicion. "Yes, officer, just a few blocks from here," she replied calmly. She tried to keep her voice steady, not wanting to escalate anything. She had dealt with officers before, but something about this one felt different. There was a subtle tension in the air, a feeling that he already had a judgment in mind. He sighed, leaning against her car slightly. "You're out pretty late. Not many people are around at this hour. Mind if I ask where you're coming from?" She glanced briefly at her dashboard clock. "I was just running some errands, officer. It's been a busy day." He shook his head slowly, muttering under his breath, though loud enough for her to hear. "Busy day, huh?" He didn't look at her when he said it, instead staring past her at the quiet street. Inside the car, she felt a mix of frustration and unease. She had no idea why he was treating her this way. She had always tried to remain respectful during traffic stops, understanding that the officer's job was not easy. Still, the condescending tone and the probing questions made her uncomfortable. She kept her hands visible on the steering wheel and stayed silent for a moment, letting him speak first. After another long pause, he finally looked back at her. "You know, some people don't belong in this neighborhood. You sure you're just running errands?" There was a slight sneer in his voice now, and she could feel the embarrassment beginning to rise in her chest. She forced herself to remain calm, choosing her words carefully. "Yes, officer, I live nearby. I'm on my way home." He made a dismissive sound as if he didn't quite believe her. "License and registration. I need to make sure everything's in order." He scribbled something on his pad, glancing up occasionally, but mostly focused on his notes. His body language was tense, almost impatient, and she could sense the judgment in every movement. Inside her, a storm of emotions brewed: anger, frustration, embarrassment, but she reminded herself to stay composed. She had learned long ago that arguing rarely helped. Instead, she offered a polite smile, keeping her hands where he could see them. She tried to make her voice as calm as possible. "I understand, officer. Here are my documents. Please let me know if there's anything else you need." He flipped through her license and registration slowly, humming under his breath. It was clear he was taking his time deliberately, and the silence stretched long enough to feel uncomfortable. Her thoughts drifted briefly to what she would say if the situation escalated, but she quickly pushed them aside. Staying calm was the only way to handle someone who seemed determined to provoke her. Around them, the world continued its quiet rhythm. A neighbor walked a dog down the street, pausing briefly to look at the scene. A car passed slowly by, headlights cutting through the dusk. Every small sound seemed amplified in the tense silence between her and the officer. She could feel the weight of his gaze, heavy and unrelenting, yet she refused to meet it with anything other than calm and composure. Finally, after what felt like an eternity, he spoke again. "You ever get any trouble around here?" His voice had a mix of suspicion and condescension, and it hit her hard. She could feel the humiliation creeping in. an uninvited guest in her chest. She took a deep breath, steadying herself. "No, officer. I've never had any trouble. I'm just trying to get home tonight." Her voice was firm yet polite, a careful balance between respect and self-respect. He paused, looking at her closely as if trying to find some fault, some reason to keep the tension alive. She noticed the small gestures, his frown, the tapping of his pen against the notepad, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. Each movement spoke volumes about his impatience, yet she remained silent, letting him speak first. A faint breeze rustled the leaves along the street, and she could feel the evening air cooling her face. It was a small comfort, a reminder that the world continued outside this moment of scrutiny. She kept her eyes forward, breathing evenly, refusing to give him any reason to escalate further. Then suddenly he straightened up and looked at her in a way that made her stomach tighten. "You ever been in trouble with the law before?" There was an insinuation in his tone that stung, a suggestion that she might be guilty simply because of who she was. She shook her head slowly, her composure intact. "No, officer. I've always tried to follow the law and do the right thing." Her words were calm, almost gentle, but underneath was a steel of determination. She would not allow herself to be humiliated without reason. For a moment there was a flicker of surprise on his face, as if her calm defiance had thrown him off. He muttered something under his breath, his pen pausing mid-scribble. The silence returned, heavy and tense, as if the world itself was holding its breath. She felt a mix of relief and continued unease. Relief that she had managed to stay composed, and unease because she knew this could easily escalate if he chose to interpret her calm as arrogance. Every nerve in her body was alert, ready for any sudden movement or unfair accusation. Yet she refused to let fear dictate her actions. She would respond with dignity, no matter what. The cop's gaze shifted briefly to the neighborhood around them, perhaps reassessing his assumptions. She sensed a momentary uncertainty, a crack in the armor of authority he had been wielding so confidently, yet it was brief. And soon he was back to the same scrutinizing stare, as if daring her to say something wrong. She kept her voice soft but steady. "I just want to go home, officer. That's all I'm trying to do tonight." There was no pleading in her tone, only clarity and honesty. She refused to apologize for existing in her own neighborhood, for driving home at her own pace, for being who she was. He scribbled something on his notepad and muttered, "Hold on a second." The words were casual, but there was an edge to them, an unspoken suggestion that she should be uncomfortable. She stayed quiet, her hands resting calmly on the wheel, her mind focused on maintaining control over her own reactions. The air seemed to thicken with tension, each passing second stretching longer than the last. She could feel the eyes of the world, or at least the few passing by on them, but she refused to let it shake her. In that moment, she realized that her calm was her weapon, her dignity her shield. No matter how the cop chose to act, she would not give him the satisfaction of seeing her falter. Finally, after a long pause, he looked back at her with a faint frown. He handed her documents back without a word, and for a fleeting moment, it seemed like the encounter might end without further incident. She took a deep breath, ready to drive away, but her instincts told her this was far from over. Something about his demeanor suggested he wasn't done, that he still had something to prove to himself or to her. She started the engine slowly, glancing at him with a polite nod. "Thank you, officer." Her tone was calm, measured, respectful, and yet underlined with a quiet strength. She knew she had held her ground, maintained her composure, and refused to be humiliated without reason. But she also knew that what had just happened was a reminder of the fragile balance between authority and respect, and the sharp edge of assumptions in the world outside her own home. As she drove away, the evening air brushing against her face through the open window, she felt a mixture of relief and lingering tension. The encounter had left a mark, subtle yet unmistakable, a reminder of how quickly situations could turn when assumptions and prejudice crept into the interaction between a person and those meant to protect and serve. She drove on, determined to reclaim her peace, but aware that the memory of this stop would linger in her mind, shaping her awareness of the world she navigated every day. The evening air felt heavier now, almost thick with tension that clung to her as she tried to make sense of what had just happened. Even as she drove away, her mind replayed the encounter. The officer's words, the way he leaned against her car, the subtle but cutting insinuations. They lingered like unwelcome shadows following her every turn. She could feel a quiet anger simmering beneath her calm exterior, but she refused to let it dictate her actions. She reminded herself that composure was her ally. That dignity mattered more than any impulsive reaction. Back on the familiar streets of her neighborhood, she noticed a few neighbors still out walking, seemingly unaware of the tension she had just endured. She took a deep breath, focusing on the small sounds of the evening. The distant bark of a dog, the hum of a passing car, the gentle rustle of leaves in the cool breeze. It helped center her, reminded her that her life, her reality, wasn't defined by the assumptions of someone else. She reached the stop sign near her street and slowed, her eyes scanning the quiet intersection. That's when she noticed the patrol car again, now slightly ahead, moving with her at a distance that felt deliberate. Her stomach tightened, realizing that he might be following her. The thought of another confrontation sent a jolt through her, but she reminded herself to stay calm. She drove carefully, hands steady on the wheel, refusing to give in to fear. The cop pulled up alongside her briefly, his window down, and gave her a questioning look. There was something in his expression, a mix of doubt, suspicion, and a need to assert control that made her uneasy. She gave a polite nod and focused on the road ahead. Her mind was sharp, analyzing every detail, trying to predict what might happen next. She knew that staying calm and composed was her best defense. He followed her for a few more blocks before finally pulling over a few feet behind her, blocking her path. She exhaled slowly, her hands gripping the wheel with quiet determination. The tension was palpable, a silent storm that seemed ready to break at any moment. She stayed still, waiting for him to approach, aware that the next few minutes could define the rest of her evening. When he finally stepped out of his car, his movements were slower, deliberate, almost theatrical. She noticed the faint scowl on his face, the way he shifted his weight from one foot to the other. There was a need in him to assert authority, to remind her that he held power in this moment. She reminded herself not to react impulsively, to keep her composure intact. "Evening," he said, his tone flat but carrying an edge of judgment. "Do you live around here?" "Yes, officer," she replied evenly, her voice steady. "Just a few blocks from here." He squinted at her for a moment as if searching for something he might have overlooked. "You sure about that? You were speeding and it doesn't look like you're coming from anywhere around here." She felt a small sting at his words. The assumption, the disbelief in her honesty was clear and frustrating, but she didn't let it show in her tone. "Yes, officer. I live nearby and I'm on my way home. I was just running errands today." The officer let out a short, dismissive sound. He leaned closer, resting a hand on the roof of her car. "Running errands? You know, this isn't exactly a neighborhood for people just wandering around. You sure you're not hiding something?" She felt a flush rise in her cheeks, a mix of anger and embarrassment, but she took a deep breath, steadying herself. "I'm not hiding anything, officer. I live here. I'm just trying to get home." His gaze lingered on her, searching for a crack in her composure, a sign that she might be nervous or scared, but she refused to give him that satisfaction. Her eyes met his steadily, calm but firm, a quiet assertion that she would not be humiliated. She could feel the subtle judgment in his stare, the assumptions he carried about her based on little more than appearance. It made her stomach tighten, but she held her ground. Around them, the world continued its evening rhythm. A car drove slowly past, the driver casting a brief glance at the unfolding scene. A neighbor returned home with groceries, pausing at the gate to glance curiously. But the tension between her and the officer created a bubble around them, a space where time seemed to stretch and the air was charged with unease. "License and registration again," he muttered, his voice low and edged with authority. She handed them over without hesitation, keeping her hands visible on the wheel. The pen he tapped against his notepad was almost a metronome, each tap echoing the impatience in his body language. She focused on her breathing, keeping it even, refusing to let the anxiety show. "You ever get into trouble with the law?" he asked suddenly, a pointed question that carried insinuation rather than curiosity. She shook her head slowly, maintaining eye contact. "No, officer. I've always tried to follow the law and do the right thing." He muttered something under his breath and scribbled on his notepad. His expression hardened, but there was a flicker of uncertainty in his eyes. For a brief moment it seemed as if her calm defiance had caught him off guard. She could feel the tension in the air shift slightly, though she knew it was only temporary. The officer leaned against her car again, this time more deliberately, as if asserting dominance. "You know, some people shouldn't be around certain neighborhoods at this time. You sure you belong here?" Her heart rate quickened, but she refused to let it show. She met his gaze evenly. "I do belong here, officer. This is my neighborhood. I'm on my way home." There was a pause, a charged silence that seemed to stretch for minutes. She could feel the weight of his judgment pressing down, heavy and unrelenting, yet she remained composed. She reminded herself that reacting impulsively could make things worse, and she focused on her inner calm, her dignity, her right to exist in her own space. He shifted his stance, the tension in his shoulders evident. The pen in his hand paused mid-tap, and he muttered something indistinct. She could sense his struggle to assert control, to justify his actions, but she didn't let it affect her. Her calm was her shield, her words measured and even, a clear statement that she would not be demeaned without reason. "I just want to go home, officer," she said softly but firmly. "That's all I'm trying to do tonight." He studied her for a moment longer, then finally straightened up. There was a flicker of hesitation in his eyes, as if he realized the limits of his authority in this moment. He handed back her documents without a word, and she exhaled slowly, relief mingling with lingering tension. She had maintained her composure, refused to be intimidated, but she knew the encounter was far from over. As she started her car, the officer stepped back, watching her carefully. She felt a subtle sense of triumph, but also a cautious awareness that authority could shift unpredictably. She kept her hands on the wheel, her eyes on the road, driving slowly and deliberately, aware of every movement, every glance. The evening settled around her, the tension gradually easing as she moved further from the stop. Yet the experience left a lingering mark. The assumptions, the subtle humiliation, the questioning of her right to exist in her own space, it all weighed on her. She reminded herself that this was not just about one traffic stop, but about dignity, respect, and the quiet assertion of her rights. She drove home slowly, the golden light fading into twilight, and felt a quiet resolve build inside her. She would not let this moment define her, would not let it break her composure or her sense of self. She would handle whatever came next with the same calm strength she had shown tonight, ready to face the consequences of an encounter that should never have been so unfair in the first place. The memory of the traffic stop would stay with her, a reminder of resilience, patience, and the quiet power of remaining composed in the face of disrespect. The street was quiet now, the sun having dipped completely behind the trees, leaving a soft twilight that bathed the neighborhood in muted shades of blue and gray. She had parked her car in front of her home, taking a moment to gather herself. Her hands were still gripping the steering wheel when the cop pulled up behind her, the patrol car's lights dim but unmistakable. She felt a flicker of unease, a reminder that the encounter was not over, and the tension that had built over the past minutes was ready to take another turn. He stepped out of the patrol car, his posture tense, eyes narrowed. There was a sharpness in his expression, a mixture of disbelief and irritation, as if he couldn't fully understand why she had remained calm under his scrutiny. She stayed seated, her hands on the wheel, exhaling slowly to keep her composure. She knew that whatever happened next could escalate quickly, and she wanted to control her reactions even if he tried to provoke her. "Evening," he said, his tone firm, carrying the authority of his badge, but tinged with doubt. "You live here, right?" "Yes, officer," she replied evenly, her voice steady and calm. "I live here." He glanced at her briefly, then down the street as if searching for something to justify his suspicion. "You sure about that? You were speeding and now you're just sitting here? Seems a little strange." She met his gaze directly, holding her calm, refusing to let frustration or fear slip into her tone. "I live here, officer. I'm just home now. I've had a long day and I'm ready to relax. That's all." For a moment he seemed caught off guard. The composure she displayed was not what he expected. His pen hovered over his notepad, tapping lightly against it, but he wasn't writing. His eyes studied her face, searching for a sign of nervousness, anything to confirm his assumptions. But there was nothing. Her calm defiance was quiet but unmistakable, a silent challenge to the authority he wielded without question. Then she decided it was time to reveal the truth. She took a deep breath, her voice still steady, and spoke clearly but without aggression. "Officer, I think it's important you know who I am. I am the wife of the sheriff in this county." His head snapped up instantly, eyes widening in shock. The pen fell from his hand with a soft clatter against the patrol car, and his posture stiffened. His mouth opened slightly, then closed, and he blinked rapidly as he tried to process the information. The sudden shift in dynamics was almost palpable. He had assumed control, assumed authority, assumed superiority, but now the power balance had changed in an instant. She stayed calm, her voice unwavering. "I wanted to tell you calmly, rather than escalate the situation further. I hope you understand that your behavior during the stop was inappropriate and unfair." He coughed slightly, a nervous gesture that betrayed his embarrassment. The realization of what he had done, the assumptions he had made, and the humiliation he had attempted to impose now reflected back on him. He had not known her identity, and that ignorance had led to a misjudgment that was now painfully clear. Around them, the world continued its evening routine, but it seemed to hold its breath. A neighbor walked past, pausing briefly to glance at the scene. There was a faint murmur of surprise in the air as the passerby realized the officer's discomfort, though no one spoke directly. The quiet tension was filled with the irony of the moment, assumptions shattered, authority questioned, and dignity standing firmly in the center. The officer rubbed the back of his neck, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, a subtle but telling display of unease. He opened his mouth as if to speak, then closed it again. His professional facade had faltered, and for the first time she saw vulnerability behind the uniform. She remained seated, her hands resting lightly on the steering wheel, maintaining her composure and quiet strength. "I understand this might be a surprise," she continued, her voice steady and clear, "but it doesn't excuse the way I was treated. It was unnecessary, and it crossed professional boundaries." He swallowed hard, eyes darting away briefly before returning to her face. I didn't know," he said, his voice low and uncertain. There was a hint of remorse, though it was tentative, unpracticed. The realization of the power shift was sinking in slowly, and he seemed unsure how to recover. She gave a small nod, acknowledging his words without softening her stance. "I understand that you didn't know, but now that you do, I hope it will be clear how important it is to approach these situations with fairness and respect. Everyone deserves to be treated with dignity, regardless of assumptions or appearances." He nodded, a stiff, formal gesture, as if trying to regain some control over his emotions and the situation. The embarrassment lingered on his face, subtle but unmistakable. He realized that the moment had not only humbled him, but also served as a lesson about assumptions and the misuse of authority. She took another breath, feeling a sense of quiet relief, though not entirely free from the lingering tension. She had maintained her composure, asserted her dignity, and revealed her identity without confrontation, transforming a humiliating encounter into a moment of truth and accountability. The cop's shock was evident, his professional pride shaken, and she felt a quiet sense of justice settling in. "I think it's best if you leave now," she said, her tone firm but polite. "I would like to end this encounter without further escalation." He hesitated, then finally stepped back, giving her space. The patrol car's lights dimmed slightly, no longer a symbol of immediate authority but a reminder of what had transpired. He opened the driver's side door, sat back in the seat, and exhaled slowly, the tension in his shoulders beginning to ease. The realization of his mistake and the presence of her identity hung in the air between them, a lesson that would not soon be forgotten. She started her car, her hands steady on the wheel, her posture calm and collected. The twilight enveloped the street, soft and quiet, as she slowly began to drive forward. The sense of relief was palpable, but so was the lingering awareness of what had just happened. She knew the encounter had not only been a personal test of composure and dignity, but also a moment that highlighted broader issues of assumptions, authority, and respect. As she moved down the street, the soft hum of her engine accompanied the gentle rustle of leaves in the evening breeze. The patrol car remained behind, stationary, a silent acknowledgement of the shift that had occurred. She glanced briefly in the rearview mirror, seeing the officer inside seemingly lost in thought, processing the events that had unfolded. The quiet street, once a simple path home, had become the stage for an unexpected lesson in humility and accountability. Her mind wandered briefly to the days ahead. She knew that the revelation of her identity would ripple beyond this single encounter. There would be conversations, investigations, perhaps even discussions about professionalism, fairness, and how authority should be exercised. But for now, she focused on the immediate sense of relief and the quiet triumph of having maintained her composure. The world around her seemed to settle as she continued to drive. The houses on either side of the street were darkening with the onset of night, the windows reflecting the soft glow of streetlights. She felt a subtle but powerful sense of reclaiming her space, her dignity intact despite the humiliation she had faced moments before. It was a reminder that strength was not always loud or confrontational. It could be quiet, composed, and unwavering. She parked in her driveway, shutting off the engine and letting the evening silence wrap around her. She sat for a moment, hands still on the wheel, reflecting on the encounter. The cop's assumptions, the condescending tone, the attempted humiliation, it all weighed on her, but she had transformed it into a lesson in patience, composure, and the assertion of dignity. Stepping out of the car, she felt the cool evening air against her skin, a small comfort after the tension of the past minutes. She walked toward her front door, each step deliberate, grounded, and calm. The experience had left a mark, but it had also reinforced the strength she carried within herself. A strength that no assumptions, no condescension, and no misuse of authority could take away. Inside her home, the quiet was soothing. She closed the door behind her and leaned against it for a moment. Letting herself exhale fully, the day's tension slowly melted away, replaced with a quiet sense of empowerment. She had faced an unfair situation, revealed the truth calmly, and reclaimed her dignity. The encounter with the officer was over, but the lessons it carried would remain with her, a reminder of the quiet power of composure, courage, and self-respect in the face of judgment and humiliation. The morning after the traffic stop, the neighborhood was calm and quiet, the kind of stillness that comes before the sun climbs fully into the sky. She sat at her kitchen table with a cup of coffee, replaying the events of the night before. Every detail, every tone, every subtle movement of the officer was etched into her memory. The mix of frustration and relief she had felt then was still present, but now it was joined by a sense of determination. She knew she had to take action, not out of revenge, but to ensure accountability and to make it clear that behavior like that could not go unchecked. The first step was contacting the sheriff. She picked up her phone and dialed the number, her voice calm and clear as she recounted the previous evening's events. The sheriff listened quietly, his expression serious, absorbing every word. He asked questions to understand the full context, not just the stop itself, but the manner in which the officer had conducted himself, the subtle humiliations, the inappropriate assumptions. When she finished, there was a long pause on the line. "You did the right thing by staying calm," the sheriff finally said, "and by telling me. We will handle this properly." The reassurance from her husband did little to ease the lingering sting, but it reinforced her resolve. This wasn't just about her. It was about fairness, respect, and the standards that law enforcement should uphold. She wanted to make sure that what had happened wouldn't happen to anyone else, that the lesson of accountability would be clear. Later that morning, she filed a formal complaint with the department. The process was detailed and precise, but she wrote everything clearly, recounting each interaction with the officer. She described his tone, his questions, the assumptions he had made, and the subtle intimidation she had endured. She stayed factual, avoiding emotional exaggeration, knowing that her composure and clear presentation would strengthen her case. This wasn't about anger or retaliation. It was about creating a record and ensuring that the incident would be reviewed seriously. Within a few hours, she received confirmation that the complaint had been officially filed and that the matter would be reviewed. There would be an internal investigation, interviews, and an examination of the officer's conduct. It was procedural, but it also represented a shift in accountability. She felt a quiet satisfaction knowing that her actions had set the wheels in motion for justice and professional correction. The officer, meanwhile, began to feel the ripple effects of his actions. The realization of his mistake weighed heavily on him. His colleagues, aware of the situation, started to notice a change in his demeanor. He was quieter than usual, cautious and hesitant to assert authority in the same way as before. The embarrassment of having misjudged someone, particularly someone so closely connected to the sheriff, was not easily forgotten. It became a personal reminder that authority carried responsibility, and assumptions could have serious consequences. As the investigation unfolded, She was invited to give a detailed account to the review board. She recounted the stop calmly and clearly, emphasizing the professional misconduct rather than personal offense. Her composure was noted, her clarity respected. The board listened attentively, recognizing both the seriousness of the officer's actions and the strength she had shown in handling the situation. The internal review led to several consequences for the officer. He received a formal reprimand, outlining the inappropriateness of his behavior and the need to adhere strictly to professional standards in all interactions. Mandatory sensitivity training was assigned, focusing on respect, bias awareness, and proper conduct during traffic stops. While it was not a punitive measure intended to destroy his career, it was a corrective action designed to improve behavior and prevent similar incidents in the future. The officer understood that his authority was not absolute and that accountability was essential. She watched the process unfold with a mixture of relief and cautious optimism. The officer's response to the reprimand and training was critical, not just for her peace of mind but for the community as a whole. Respect and fairness were not optional. They were fundamental to trust between law enforcement and the people they served. She hoped that the lessons learned would extend beyond this single incident, influencing how officers approach their duties in the future. The community around them, though initially unaware of the full story, began to notice subtle changes. Conversations sparked about fairness, authority, and the importance of treating everyone with dignity. The incident became a quiet catalyst for reflection among residents, sparking dialogue about how assumptions could lead to unfair treatment, and the importance of standing up for oneself respectfully when confronted with such situations. She also found herself reflecting deeply on the personal impact of the event. While the encounter had been uncomfortable and humiliating, it had also reinforced her own strength and resilience. She realized that composure, clarity, and dignity were powerful tools in moments of conflict. She had maintained control over her reactions, asserted her rights without aggression, and transformed a potentially degrading experience into a moment of empowerment. In the days following, she continued her routine, but with a renewed sense of awareness. Every interaction, every subtle sign of authority, carried with it the memory of that night. She remained vigilant but not fearful. Instead, she felt confident, understanding that her actions and composure had tangible effects on accountability and fairness. Her experience became a quiet source of empowerment, a reminder that self-respect and careful action could influence outcomes far beyond a single moment. The sheriff implemented a review of local law enforcement practices, emphasizing the importance of respect, fairness, and professionalism. Programs were introduced to provide officers with additional training in communication, bias awareness, and conflict resolution. These changes, while incremental, reflected a commitment to preventing similar incidents and ensuring that the community could trust law enforcement to act with integrity. Through it all, she remained composed and focused on what mattered most: fairness, accountability, and dignity. She understood that the incident was both personal and public, and she approached it with the same calm determination she had displayed during the traffic stop. The experience, though initially uncomfortable, had become a catalyst for change, highlighting the importance of standing firm in the face of unjust treatment and advocating for standards that protected everyone. As the days turned into weeks, the officer completed his required training and reflected on his actions. The reprimand remained part of his record, a reminder of the need for professionalism and fairness. The community, observing the handling of the incident, gained confidence that accountability was possible and that unjust behavior would not be ignored. The incident had sparked change, not through confrontation or anger, but through calm persistence and a commitment to justice. For her, the process reinforced the value of clarity, composure, and measured action. She had faced humiliation, unfair assumptions, and a challenge to her dignity. Yet she had emerged with her sense of self intact and a tangible impact on accountability. The experience reminded her that strength was not always loud or aggressive. It could be quiet, steady, and unwavering, capable of transforming difficult moments into lessons that reached beyond the individual. By the end of the review process, she felt a sense of closure. The officer had been held accountable, the community had observed the commitment to fairness, and she had maintained her composure and dignity throughout. The incident remained a vivid memory, but it no longer carried the sting of humiliation. Instead, it was a testament to the power of calm action, the importance of standing firm in the face of unfairness, and the quiet strength that comes from self-respect and determination. She knew that the lessons learned would resonate not just within the department, but in the broader community, reinforcing the principles of respect, accountability, and fairness that were essential for trust and harmony. The days after the incident passed in a quiet rhythm, the neighborhood returning to its usual routines. Though the memory of the traffic stop remained vivid for her, she went about her life as usual, running errands, attending meetings, and managing the small daily challenges that everyone faces, but with a renewed sense of awareness and strength. The encounter with the officer, the humiliation she had faced, and the subsequent accountability process had left a lasting impression, not only on her but on the way she viewed interactions, authority, and personal dignity. She found herself reflecting often on the balance of power and the importance of composure. The traffic stop had been a moment that tested her patience, her resolve, and her confidence, but she had emerged with her dignity intact. She realized that maintaining calm, speaking clearly, and asserting one's rights without aggression could have a far-reaching impact, both on personal outcomes and on broader social awareness. Her relationship with the sheriff, already strong, had become a quiet support system through the ordeal. Their discussions were calm, reflective, and focused on solutions rather than blame. They talked about fairness, responsibility, and how to encourage positive change within the department. These conversations strengthened her understanding that change often begins in small moments, and that careful, composed actions could ripple outward to affect larger systems. The officer, meanwhile, continued to process the incident and its consequences. The formal reprimand, sensitivity training, and the awareness that his behavior had been observed and corrected weighed heavily on him. He had come face to face with the realization that authority carried responsibility, and that assumptions based on appearance or bias could not guide professional conduct. Over time, his demeanor adjusted. He was more cautious, more aware, and, in subtle ways, more respectful in his interactions. The community, though not initially aware of the details, noticed a change in the dynamics between residents and local law enforcement. Conversations began to surface about fairness, respect, and the importance of holding those in authority accountable. Her calm handling of the situation became an unspoken example of dignity and strength, a reminder that it was possible to assert oneself without aggression and still command respect. She took it upon herself to participate in community discussions about fairness, trust, and professionalism in law enforcement. Her voice was calm, reasoned, and informed by personal experience. She shared insights about composure, the importance of standing firm in the face of unfairness, and the ways in which accountability could lead to meaningful change. People listened, not because of anger or drama, but because of the clarity and human perspective she brought to the conversation. Through these discussions, she realized that the experience had given her more than just a story of a traffic stop. It had given her a perspective on resilience, empathy, and the power of calm action. She understood that moments of challenge could be transformed into lessons, not only for oneself but for the broader community. Her approach became a subtle yet effective form of advocacy for fairness and respect. At home, she continued her routines with a sense of purpose and quiet reflection.